Somewhere underground right now, a machine is waiting for a signal it hopes never comes. It doesn't need a president, it doesn't need a general, it doesn't need a single living human being to end the world. Stick around, because by the end of this, you'll understand exactly how close it came to firing and why it's still armed today. Moscow, 1985. Inside a bunker buried deep beneath the Russian countryside, a machine wakes up. Nobody ordered it to. Nobody is watching it happen. It simply begins, because the conditions it was built to detect have finally appeared, and no one is left to stop it. This is Perimeter. The West calls it Dead Hand. And it may be the most terrifying machine ever built. Not because of what it does, but because of what it was designed to do after everyone capable of stopping it was already dead. To understand why the Soviet Union built a machine like this, you have to understand the problem before it. By the early 1980s, both superpowers had enough nuclear weapons to destroy each other many times over, and that destructive power created a strange kind of stability. Neither side would strike first because striking first meant being destroyed in return. Planners called it mutually assured destruction, and for 3 decades it worked. The threat of retaliation was the lock on the cage, but locks can be picked. And Soviet strategists became convinced the Americans had found a way to pick this one. The weapon that worried them most was the Pershing II, a missile deployed to West Germany in 1983, with a flight time to Moscow of roughly 6 minutes. 6 minutes is not enough time to wake a leader, confirm an attack, and issue a retaliatory order through the normal chain of command. 6 minutes is barely enough time to answer a phone. Soviet planners gave this scenario a name: a decapitation strike, a single, fast, overwhelming blow aimed not at cities or missile silos, but at the people with the authority to order retaliation. Kill the leadership before they can give the order, and the entire Soviet arsenal sits untouched in its silos, fully armed and completely useless, because there is no one left alive to say the word. This is the problem Soviet engineers were handed in 1974. Build a system that guarantees retaliation, even if the entire chain of command is dead. And what they came back with wasn't a bigger arsenal or a faster missile. It was something almost nobody believed a machine could be trusted to do. It sounds simple until you try to design it. The system had to be able to launch without a human being, because the humans might all be gone, but it could not be allowed to run constantly and decide on its own, because a sensor glitch, a solar flare, or a software bug could end the world by accident. And whatever they built had to survive the very strike it was meant to respond to, buried deep enough that the same warheads that killed the leadership could not also destroy the machine meant to answer for them. 3 contradictory requirements: autonomous but not reckless, powerful but survivable. Engineers at the Scientific Research Institute of Instrument Design in Moscow spent over a decade solving it, and the solution they built was stranger than anything in Cold War fiction. In peacetime, the system sleeps. Its sensors are disconnected. Its launch authority is switched off. It does nothing until a senior Soviet official, someone with the rank of General Secretary, Defense Minister, or Chief of the General Staff, deliberately activates it during a crisis. That single act of activation is the only ordinary human decision the entire system requires. Everything after that point is automatic. Once switched on, Perimeter starts listening. Seismic sensors track ground tremors across Soviet territory. Radiation detectors watch for spikes in background radiation. Pressure gauges monitor for the specific atmospheric signature of a nuclear detonation. Communications equipment listens across military frequencies for the normal chatter of a functioning command structure. Then the machine runs its logic, one question at a time. And this is where it gets unnerving, because a computer built in the 1970s is about to be trusted with a decision no human wanted to make alone. First, has a nuclear weapon detonated on Soviet soil? If the answer is no, the system waits, watching, dormant but alert. If the answer is yes, it asks a second question. Second, can it reach the Soviet General Staff? It tries the war room, checking every communication link available. If someone answers, if command is still alive and functioning, Perimeter hands authority straight back to the humans and shuts itself down. The machine assumes its job is finished the moment it hears a human voice on the other end. But if there is only silence where the war room should be, the machine reaches a conclusion no person has told it to reach. Leadership is gone. Then comes the third and final question. Has enough time passed, somewhere between 15 minutes and an hour depending on the situation, to rule out a simple communications failure rather than a decapitation strike? If the silence holds, the system moves to its last stage. It transfers full launch authority not to a president, not to a general, but to a small duty crew stationed deep inside a hardened bunker somewhere in Russian territory. These are not decision makers in the traditional sense. The decision has already been made by the machine. Their role is narrower. Confirm that what they see matches what the sensors report, then perform one physical act, authorizing the launch of what are called command rockets. The command rockets are Perimeter's signature piece of engineering, and they are unlike any other missile ever built. They carry no warheads. Instead, each one is fitted with a powerful radio transmitter. Once launched, a command rocket flies a pre-programmed arc across the entire breadth of Soviet territory, broadcasting a single coded signal on military frequencies as it goes. That signal is a launch authorization heard by every surviving element of the Soviet nuclear arsenal: silos, submarines, mobile launchers, anything still capable of receiving a radio transmission from the sky. Those systems do not need a phone call from a general or a key turned by a named human being. A signal from a missile flying overhead is authorization enough. What remains of the Soviet nuclear force fires, from the moment a warhead detonates on Soviet soil to the moment retaliatory missiles are airborne, the entire process could take under an hour, all of it possible without a single living member of the original chain of command. That's the machine, but the real story isn't the engineering. It's what happened when the world finally found out it existed, and the question nobody in Washington could answer. For years, this machine's existence was one of the Soviet Union's most closely guarded secrets. Western intelligence had no confirmed knowledge. Perimeter existed until the early 1990s, when a retired Soviet officer described it publicly as something close to an open secret inside the military. The reaction in Washington moved through disbelief and alarm, then landed on an uncomfortable question. If this machine guaranteed retaliation no matter what, why had the Soviets never told anyone? It is a fair question, because a doomsday machine only works as a deterrent if your enemy knows it exists. Keep it hidden, and a first strike still looks survivable to the side considering it. When that exact question was put to Valery Yarenich, one of the system's chief designers, in a later interview, his answer was direct. Soviet leadership feared that announcing Perimeter would only invite the Americans to develop new ways of destroying it before it could ever be used. Secrecy, in their eyes, protected the machine's usefulness, even as it undermined its power to deter. But there's a second secret buried inside Perimeter, one stranger than the first, and one Yarenich only revealed decades later. Yarenich described a second purpose behind Perimeter, one built into the system from the very beginning, and rarely discussed outside small circles of Soviet strategists. Perimeter was not only meant to guarantee revenge, it was meant to buy time. In a crisis, a Soviet leader warned of an incoming attack faced brutal pressure to decide within minutes, because launching late meant losing your own missiles in their silos, and a false alarm cost the same as ignoring a real one. Perimeter changed that math. Once activated, a leader no longer had to decide immediately, because retaliation was already guaranteed regardless of what happened to him personally. He could wait, he could verify. He could take the extra minutes panic would otherwise steal, because the machine had already promised the response would come regardless. Yarenich called this Perimeter's true purpose. Not a doomsday device built for vengeance, but a buffer against panic, engineered specifically to slow down the most dangerous decision a human being could ever be asked to make in 6 minutes or less. The system's usefulness was tested almost immediately, and not in the way anyone expected. In November of 1983, before Perimeter was even fully operational, NATO ran a training exercise called Able Archer. It simulated the full nuclear release procedures NATO would use in a real war, involving heads of state, radio blackouts, and a staged escalation toward the highest alert level. It was realistic enough that Soviet intelligence monitoring it from a distance could not say with confidence whether they were watching a drill or the opening moves of an actual attack. Soviet forces stationed in East Germany and Poland were quietly placed on alert. Aircraft were armed. Units moved without explanation. For several tense days, elements of the Soviet military prepared for a war they believed might already be starting. This wasn't a hypothetical drill gone wrong in a book somewhere. It nearly happened, and almost nobody outside the Kremlin knew how close it came. Perimeter was not yet finished. It would not come online for another 14 months, but the decision to build it had already been made, and the engineers working on it in late 1983 understood exactly why their work mattered. The Soviet leadership had just spent days uncertain whether the world was ending, unable to fully trust their own instincts about what they were seeing. Perimeter became fully operational in January 1985. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the system passed quietly into the hands of the new Russian Federation, along with the rest of the inherited nuclear arsenal. In 2011, the commander of Russia's strategic missile forces confirmed publicly, without offering technical details, that Perimeter was still active and had been modernized since the Soviet years. What that confirmation means is unsettling. Somewhere in Russia today, buried sensors still measure the ground for tremors. Radiation detectors still scan the atmosphere. Pressure gauges still watch for the signature of a nuclear blast. All of it feeds into a hardened computing system built to survive the very strike it exists to answer. The machine is dormant, not active, but it is maintained, tested, and understood by the few people trained to operate it. If a Russian official ever activates it during a future crisis, and that official is then killed, and communication with the general staff goes silent for long enough, the machine will reach its own conclusion without asking permission from anyone. A small crew in a bunker will have exactly one question to answer, and one action left to take. So is a machine like this actually safe to leave running for 40 years? The man who built it spent the rest of his life wrestling with that exact question. The designers always framed Perimeter as a safeguard rather than a threat. A machine built to remove the temptation of a hasty decision made under 6 minutes of unbearable pressure. In principle, its trigger is narrow, a confirmed detonation, followed by confirmed silence from command. In practice, 1983 showed how easily drill and disaster can blur when sensors and human judgment are pushed to their limits together. Yerenich, interviewed near the end of his life, was asked whether he still believed Perimeter had been the right choice. He said the logic of mutual destruction made the machine rational, and that a world without any guarantee of retaliation, one where a single decapitation strike could erase the entire deterrent, frightened him far more than the machine he had helped build. Then he added something the interviewer noted he seemed to have carried for years. He said he hoped no one would ever find out whether it actually worked. Yerenich died in 2013. He spent much of his career designing a system meant to function only after everyone he knew was already dead, and much of the rest of his life quietly hoping it would never have to. Somewhere underground tonight, the sensors are still listening. The machine is still there, it is still running.